February 1932. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson read a telegram that was meant to humiliate him and warn everyone else. Chicago answered with 17 men in number chosen to end the conversation forever. By morning, Harlem was quiet, and the most powerful gangster in America had a decision to make. What happened in those hours that forced the Mafia to walk away instead of finishing the job? February 1932 arrived in Harlem without ceremony, but it did not arrive quietly. The neighborhood was awake before sunrise not because of sirens or gunfire, but because tension had been building for weeks beneath the surface. Harlem knew when something was coming even if no one said it out loud. Bumpy Johnson had not issued a threat. He did not need to. The message that left Harlem for Chicago was short, controlled, and deliberate, written in the language of final boundaries rather than insults. It did not beg negotiator posture. It simply stated a line and made clear that the line would not move. To Bumpy, the message was practical. Harlem was not another outpost to be drained and discarded. It was a community with memory, pride, and limits. Outside money could pass through, but it would not dictate terms, and it would not stay if it disrespected the people who lived there. In Chicago, the telegram landed differently. When Al Capone read it, he did not see restraint, he saw defiance. The words carried no profanity, no raised voice. Yet they struck harder than an open threat. Someone had told him no, and worse, had done so without fear. Capone had built his empire on the idea that resistance collapsed once pressure was applied. Cities bent, rivals backed down. Men learned quickly when to fall silent. Harlem's message suggested something dangerous, that silence could also be a weapon and that it could be used against him. Those close to Capone later recalled that he read the telegram more than once. Not because it was unclear, but because it was unmistakable. The message did not ask for compromise. It assumed control already existed and that Chicago's presence was temporary. Capone understood the risk immediately. If Harlem could reject him openly, other territories might follow. Authority in his world depended on example. Disobedience had to be answered, not negotiated, or it spread. There were voices in the room that suggested caution. Harlem was distant. New York politics were complicated. Violence there attracted attention in ways Chicago operations did not. But restraint in this moment carried its own danger. Capone decided the response would not be symbolic. It would be overwhelming, not a warning shot, not a negotiation disguised as force, but a correction so decisive that it would never need repeating. Harlem would learn what resistance cost. The order was simple. Send men who did not hesitate. Men who had survived street wars, betrayals, and long nights where mercy did not exist. Not locals, not intermediaries, Chicago men, loyal and direct. The number was not arbitrary. 17 was not chosen because it was neat, but because it was excessive. It was meant to end discussion before it began. No one was supposed to survive long enough to explain what had happened. While Chicago prepared, Harlem continued its routines. Shops opened. Numbers runners moved quietly. Conversations happened in half sentences and glances. No one announced a state of emergency, but plans began shifting almost immediately. Bumpy did not raise his voice or gather crowds. He had learned long ago that preparation was invisible when done correctly. Harlem did not need to be warned, it needed to be ready. People who worked near train stations watched more closely than usual. Phone calls were shorter. Meetings ended earlier. Homes that mattered quietly emptied without drama or explanation. The difference between Chicago and Harlem was not weapons or numbers. It was familiarity. Bumpy knew the streets not as routes, but as habits. He knew who noticed strangers who talked too much and who stayed quiet when things felt wrong. As the train carrying Capone's men began its journey east, Harlem was already adjusting its breathing. This was not panic. It was recognition. A challenge had been issued and a response was coming. No one in Harlem believed the conflict would end with words, but few understood how far Chicago was willing to go or how fully Harlem had committed to standing its ground. The telegram had done its work. It had stripped away ambiguity. What remained was a test not of firepower, but of resolve. Chicago believed force would decide it. Harlem believed something else entirely. By the time the first men stepped off the train in New York, the message had already changed everything. Not because of what it said, but because of what it refused to do. It did not ask permission. It did not seek approval. It did not apologize. And in the world Al Capone ruled, that was the most dangerous kind of message anyone could send. Chicago did not send an army because armies attract attention. It sent specialist men selected not for how loud they were, but for how efficiently they ended problems. The decision reflected confidence, not caution. These were not recruits pulled off the street or hired muscle chasing quick money. Each man had survived the kind of gang wars that reduced neighborhoods to rumors and court files. They were chosen because they had already proven one thing: they did not hesitate. Within Capone's organization, selection carried meaning. Being named to this group was not a promotion but a test. The assignment suggested the outcome was already decided. Some had earned reputations during the beer wars, others during quieter conflicts that never made headlines. Their names were known inside rooms the public never entered. Outside of those rooms, they did not exist. They traveled light in words, heavy in experience. Instructions were delivered without ceremony and accepted without questions. Everyone understood what this trip was for. The belief in Chicago was simple and deeply ingrained. Harlem was loud, crowded, emotional. It would react before it prepared, and reaction could be punished. Capone's men expected confusion when they arrived. They expected shouting threats, maybe scattered resistance. What they did not expect was silence. The number 17 was meant to close the matter quickly. It allowed for redundancy, margin, and control. If one team failed, another would finish the work. They moved as if the city ahead of them had no memory, as if territory was something that could be overwritten, not defended. Chicago had done it before. On the train east, there were no speeches and no bravado. Conversations were practical, clipped, and focused on timing. Violence to them was not emotional, it was procedural. They reviewed locations, routines, and fallback routes. They assumed information was incomplete but sufficient. Harlem in their minds was another grid to be solved. What they did not discuss was community. Chicago operations relied on fear and money, not cooperation. The idea that a neighborhood might act as a single organism was dismissed as exaggeration. In Capone's world, people talked eventually. Pressure always worked. Harlem would be no different. The men arriving in New York did not fan out immediately. They observed, waiting for the city to betray itself through noise or movement. They expected signs of panic. There were none. The streets did not change their pace. Shops opened on schedule. Cars moved as usual. Harlem did not announce awareness. This absence of reaction was misread as ignorance. Chicago mistook discipline for weakness. They assumed the message had not yet landed. What the men could not see was how early Harlem had begun to adjust. The work of preparation had been quiet, deliberate, and distributed. No single signal existed to intercept. Information did not travel through official channels. It moved through people who noticed patterns, not uniforms. By the time Chicago men looked for resistance, resistance had already positioned itself. The strength of the 17 lay in speed and decisiveness. The weakness lay in assumption. They believed force alone would compress time in their favor. Capone had trusted that reputation would do part of the work. The name alone was expected to fracture resolve. Harlem had heard that name before. Inside Chicago's structure, hierarchy was rigid. Orders flowed down, not outward. Harlem operated differently, relying on trust built through proximity rather than fear imposed from distance. As plans finalized, no one in the group considered retreat. That concept did not exist in the briefing. Retreat would have implied the mission itself was flawed. Each man believed he was arriving as part of the correction, not the gamble. The outcome had been decided in Chicago. Harlem simply had not accepted it yet. The difference between expectation and reality widened with every hour. Chicago measured time in minutes and actions. Harlem measured it in anticipation. When the men finally moved into position, they believed they were early. In truth, they were already late. The city had been watching them since the moment they arrived. Not openly, not dramatically, but persistently. Strangers were noticed. Chicago's men did not understand that Harlem did not need a warning shot. It understood what 17 men meant. By the time the first decision was made on the ground, the advantage Chicago believed it held had begun to evaporate. The margin for error had narrowed to nothing. 17 had been chosen to overwhelm. Instead, it became a number that required explanation. An explanation in the world these men lived in only came after something had gone wrong. What Chicago had sent east was not a negotiation team or a warning, it was a conclusion. Harlem's response would determine whether that conclusion stood. No one on the train had considered the possibility that it would not. By the time the Chicago men began moving through Harlem, the neighborhood had already changed shape. Not visibly, not in ways an outsider would notice, but in its internal rhythm. Doors that usually stayed open were closed. Conversations shortened. The city inhaled and held its breath. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Lights stayed on in storefronts. Music drifted from familiar clubs. Windows glowed the way they always had. Harlem did not look like a place preparing for violence. That was the trap. Chicago's men were trained to read chaos. They knew how to spot panic-hurried exits, sloppy mistakes made under pressure. What they were not trained to recognize was discipline masquerading as normalcy. Every location they had mapped still appeared active. Shadows moved behind curtains. Radios played. Footsteps echoed in hallways. It looked like business as usual, which confirmed what they already believed, that Harlem had not reacted in time. But reaction had already happened. It had simply happened earlier and quieter than Chicago expected. The people who mattered were gone. Not fleeing, not hiding in fear, but repositioned. Apartments that had been full hours earlier were empty now, stripped down to furniture and silence. Back rooms were cleared. Paper trails disappeared. Harlem had not evacuated. It had redistributed itself. Chicago's men did not notice at first because no alarms were tripped. No one ran. No one shouted. The absence of resistance was mistaken for ignorance. What they did not understand was that Harlem did not rely on sirens or signals. It relied on recognition. Strangers were noticed not by uniforms but by behavior. The way men stood too still. The way they looked at corners instead of faces. Every block had eyes, but none of them stared. The illusion was deliberate. Lights stayed on to suggest occupancy. Music played to suggest routine. The city performed itself convincingly because it had done so under pressure before. Chicago's men moved through streets that felt familiar and wrong at the same time. Too orderly. Too calm. Harlem was never silent in the way it was silent now. Still, they pushed forward. Plans were already in motion. Targets were set. The absence of people was interpreted as luck. What Chicago believed was happening was a delay. What was actually happening was alignment. Positions had been chosen not for drama but for angles. Windows that overlooked entrances. Rooftops with clean sightlines. Doorways that forced movement into narrow spaces. No maps existed for this arrangement. No diagrams were drawn. It was built from memory and habit, from knowing where people walked when they thought no one was watching. The city had not emptied itself to run. It had emptied itself to make room. Chicago's men began to sense something off only when time kept passing without interruption. No confrontations, no warnings, just the feeling of being early to something that should have already happened. They did not realize that being early was exactly where Harlem wanted them. Inside buildings meant to be busy, rooms echoed. Chairs sat where people should have been. A radio played to no one. The emptiness was discovered too late to matter. By then the city had closed around them. Harlem did not attack immediately. It waited. Movement was allowed to continue, routes followed, habits confirmed. Each step Chicago took tightened the shape forming around them. The absence of people created predictability. Predictability created control. Chicago had brought force, expecting it to compress events into their favor. Harlem stretched time instead, letting the weight of anticipation do its work. There were no orders shouted across streets, no whistles or hand signals. The coordination was internal, understood, and silent. The city had become a held breath. Chicago's mistake was assuming resistance required presence. They believed that if people were not visible, they were not ready. Harlem proved the opposite. What was missing from the streets was not courage, it was distraction. When the first realization set in that they were moving through a stage set rather than a living neighborhood, it was already irreversible. The exits they assumed were clear had been observed. The routes they trusted had been measured. The city had not disappeared, it had leaned back. From above, from across, from behind glass and brick, Harlem waited without urgency. It did not rush to meet Chicago's men. It allowed them to settle into the space that had been prepared for them. Chicago thought the delay worked in their favor. Harlem knew it worked in theirs. This was not an ambush built on surprise. It was built on certainty. The certainty that once men committed to a plan, they rarely questioned it until it failed. Harlem had removed everything unnecessary and left only what mattered. Space, silence, time. By the moment Chicago understood the streets were empty on purpose, the city was no longer something they were moving through. It was something that had already moved around them, and Harlem was done waiting. The realization came too late to change anything. By the time the Chicago men understood Harlem had been emptied on purpose, they were already standing in places designed to hold them still. Corners that looked ordinary now functioned as cages. Retreat was not impossible in theory, but it was impractical in reality. Every step backward exposed a line they could not see, a window they had already passed, a rooftop they had never checked. Movement itself became a liability. This was not a battle that unfolded. It was a mechanism that closed. Harlem did not announce the moment it began. There was no signal, no shouted command, no sound meant to intimidate. The city simply shifted from waiting to acting as if following a schedule that had already run its course. The first shots were not meant to start a fight. They were meant to end one before it could begin. Those who survived the initial seconds later struggled to explain what happened next. Some remembered a sharp crack from above, others swore it came from across the street. No one agreed on sequence, only on outcome. The angles had been chosen carefully. Entrances forced bodies into narrow frames. Open doorways became exposure rather than shelter. Streets that felt wide minutes earlier now offered no cover at all. Chicago's men tried to respond, but response required orientation. Orientation required time. Harlem gave them neither. This was not chaos, it was compression. Gunfire did not echo endlessly. It came in controlled bursts, spaced just enough to prevent movement. Anyone who tried to run discovered that escape routes had already been measured. The city did not fire wildly. It fired with restraint, as if conserving something more valuable than ammunition. Men dropped where they stood, not dramatically, not ceremoniously. There were no last words worth recording. Death arrived without narrative. Some tried to retreat into buildings they believed were safe. Those buildings had already been emptied, stripped of hiding places, reduced to open rooms with no exits that mattered. Walls did not protect when angles were wrong. Chicago had prepared for resistance. It had not prepared for precision. Those who returned fire found nothing to aim at. Shadows shifted, but never lingered. Windows went dark the moment they were noticed. Harlem did not reveal itself long enough to be struck. The men realized then that they were not fighting a crew. They were fighting a neighborhood that had learned how to disappear at the exact moment it mattered. Time fractured. Seconds felt extended. Movement slowed not from injury but from uncertainty. Every decision carried consequences that arrived immediately. Some tried to regroup. The regrouping points had already been accounted for. The crossfire did not trap everyone at once. It narrowed options, gradually forcing men toward spaces where the city had already decided what would happen next. Survival became a question of position, not skill. There were moments of resistance, brief and futile. Shots fired into darkness. Orders shouted to men who were no longer there. Courage existed, but it was misplaced. Harlem did not need bravery, it needed timing. Witnesses later disagreed on how long it lasted. Some said minutes. Others swore it felt like hours. The truth sat somewhere between perception and shock. What was consistent was the speed with which it ended. When the firing stopped, it stopped completely. The silence afterward was heavier than the noise that preceded it. No sirens followed immediately. No crowds gathered. The city did not rush to fill the space left behind. Bodies remained where they fell, as if the street itself was unwilling to acknowledge what had just occurred. Harlem had made its point and withdrew from view. Those few who were still alive understood then that the message was not finished. Killing had not been the objective. Communication had. One man would be allowed to walk away. Not by accident, not by mercy mistaken for weakness, but by design. That decision carried weight. It transformed the event from violence into statement. It ensured that what happened in Harlem would not remain in Harlem. The survivor was not chased. He was not threatened as he left. The absence of pursuit made the warning clearer than any shouted demand could have. Harlem did not want witnesses. It wanted understanding. By the time authorities arrived, the scene had already begun to distort. Timelines conflicted. Positions were misremembered. Details blurred. But the outcome did not change. Men sent to impose order had encountered something they could not control. Chicago had believed force could rewrite territory. Harlem demonstrated that territory, when unified, could rewrite force. What remained on the streets was not triumph, but finality. No celebration followed. No victory was claimed publicly. The crossfire had done what it was meant to do. It corrected an assumption. Harlem did not chase power outward. It defended what was already its own. And for the first time in a long while, Chicago understood that some places could not be taken, only respected, or avoided entirely. He was not spared by mistake. He was spared because the story required a witness. In a night where precision mattered more than volume, survival was not random. One man remained standing because someone had already decided he needed to walk away. The choice was deliberate. Harlem did not want another body added to the count. It wanted a voice that would carry what had happened beyond the neighborhood intact and undeniable. The meeting did not look like a confrontation. There were no raised weapons, no shouting, no visible threat. That absence was intentional because fear delivered calmly travels farther. Those close to the moment later described it as unnerving. The man expected anger, punishment, perhaps a final act of violence. Instead, he encountered composure. The message was not written down. No paper changed hands. Nothing existed that could be photographed, seized, or denied outright. Words were chosen carefully, meant to be remembered rather than recorded. He was told what had happened not as a boast, but as a fact. Men had come. Plans had failed. Harlem had responded. There was no demand for apology, no request for recognition. The tone suggested the matter was already settled and this conversation was simply closing the file. What made the moment powerful was not the threat of death, but the certainty of restraint. He understood that if he were killed, the meaning would shift. If he lived, the meaning would remain clear. The man listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. Every instinct told him that disagreement would be pointless. He was reminded where he stood. Not geographically, but strategically. This was not Chicago. The rules he knew did not apply here. Harlem did not claim superiority. It claimed ownership. The distinction mattered. The message was simple, though its implications were not. Harlem was not available for takeover, not through intimidation, not through numbers, not through reputation. What happened next depended entirely on what he chose to report. Harlem understood that part as well. He was allowed to leave without escort. No one followed him to ensure compliance. Trust was extended because it was backed by proof. The walk away from Harlem felt longer than the arrival. Each step carried weight. The absence of pursuit was more unsettling than a chase would have been. By the time he boarded the train west, the message had already hardened into something permanent. It would not soften with distance. In Chicago, his return raised immediate questions. 17 men had gone east. Only one had come back. There were no theatrics when he spoke. No embellishment. Just an account delivered in measured tones stripped of emotion. He described the preparation, the silence, the precision, the fact that nothing had unfolded the way it was supposed to. Most importantly, he explained why he was alive. The explanation changed the room. Death could be dismissed as failure or bad luck. Survival with intention could not. What Harlem had done was not merely repel an attack. It had forced a calculation. Continue and the cost would escalate beyond control. The message carried no deadlines and offered no negotiations. That absence was part of its strength. Chicago was left with a choice, and for the first time in years, that choice did not involve escalation. Those listening understood immediately what was at stake. A second attempt would not be interpreted as persistence, it would be interpreted as defiance, and defiance after what had already occurred would demand a response even harsher than the first. The man who lived did not frame Harlem as victorious, he framed it as resolved. The matter in his telling was closed unless reopened intentionally. That framing mattered. It gave Chicago an exit without public humiliation. Power in that moment did not shift hands loudly. It adjusted quietly behind closed doors among men who understood consequences. No statement was issued. No announcement followed. The absence of action spoke louder than retaliation ever could. Harlem did not pursue. It did not threaten again. It simply remained. The man who lived carried that silence with him for the rest of his life. He had seen what happened when a neighborhood decided not to blink. He had delivered the message exactly as intended. And Chicago, after weighing the cost, chose to listen. The streets of Harlem returned to their routines not because danger had passed, but because it had been addressed. The message had been sent, received, and accepted. Nothing more needed to be said. The news reached Chicago without ceremony, but it landed with weight. One man returned where 17 had departed, and that imbalance alone demanded explanation. In a world built on control, numbers mattered, and this number was impossible to ignore. No one asked first about the dead. They asked why one lived. Survival in this context was not a relief, it was evidence. The account was delivered behind closed doors without witnesses who did not need to be there. No names were raised, no emotions indulged, just a sequence of facts laid out carefully and without interruption. The room listened because the alternative was pretending nothing had happened. What unsettled Chicago was not the loss itself. Loss could be absorbed, written off, explained away as miscalculation. What unsettled them was the pattern, how efficiently the loss had occurred and how deliberately it had been contained. There was no argument over whether the operation had failed. That much was clear. The question was whether failure demanded escalation or restraint. For years, Chicago had answered every challenge with pressure until resistance collapsed. That approach had built an empire, but it had also created a habit. Habits when broken force reconsideration. Harlem had not answered with noise or spectacle. It had answered with silence, preparation, and a result that could not be reframed. That combination was new, and new variables made old formulas unreliable. Some in the room urged retaliation. Reputation, they argued, required response. A failure unanswered would be read as weakness elsewhere. Territories watched closely when power hesitated. Others said nothing at first. They waited, measuring not pride but cost. Maps were spread out. Routes, resources, and attention were considered. Harlem was not isolated. It was surrounded by scrutiny, politics, and proximity that Chicago could not easily manage. Every move there echoed louder than in cities where influence ran deeper. Someone asked the practical question no one wanted to voice. How many men would it take next time, and how many would come back? The room stayed quiet longer than usual. Silence here was not uncertainty. It was calculation. What Chicago faced was not a rival empire. It was a boundary. Harlem was not expanding, not provoking further conflict, not claiming superiority. It was simply refusing access. That refusal changed the equation. There was no prize to seize, only resistance to overcome, and resistance that showed no signs of cracking. Escalation would require visibility. Visibility would invite attention. Attention would bring consequences that money could not erase. Chicago's strength had always been knowing where pressure could be applied quietly. Harlem offered no such leverage. The decision, when it came, was not announced. It did not need to be. Orders shifted. Routes adjusted. Contacts went unanswered. Harlem was not mentioned again in planning sessions. Not as a target, not as a problem, not as an opportunity. It was simply removed from consideration. This was not framed as retreat. It was framed as prioritization. Resources would go where control was possible, where outcomes could be shaped predictably. The distinction mattered. Chicago did not lose Harlem. It chose not to pursue it further. Outwardly, nothing changed. There were no apologies, no explanations offered to outsiders. The narrative, such as it was suggested business reasons, shifting markets, better opportunities elsewhere. Inside the organization, the understanding was clearer. Harlem was expensive in ways that could not be justified. The absence of further attempts spoke louder than any declaration could have. Weeks passed, then months. No new teams arrived, no probes followed. In criminal circles, patterns are noticed quickly. The lack of movement did not go unnoticed. Whispers spread, then settled into accepted truth. Harlem was off limits. That understanding reshaped behavior. Other organizations adjusted their expectations. Deals were structured differently. Boundaries were respected not because they were enforced daily, but because they had been enforced once decisively. Chicago's decision did not elevate Harlem publicly. It did something more enduring, it stabilized it. By choosing not to challenge again, Chicago acknowledged a limit without naming it. That acknowledgement carried weight across the country. For Chicago, the lesson was not humiliation. It was efficiency. Empires did not fall from one failed operation, but they weakened when they chased fights that offered no return. Harlem offered no return, only resistance cost and attention. The man who had delivered the message was never asked to repeat it. He did not need to. The outcome spoke for itself. Years later, those who had been in that room would recall the moment not as a defeat, but as a correction. A rare instance where power paused and reconsidered rather than doubled down. Harlem remained where it was. Chicago moved on. No treaty was signed. No line was drawn on paper. Yet the boundary held. Sometimes power is not proven by what it takes, but by what it decides not to pursue. There was no document to file away, no agreement stamped and signed, no photograph to circulate years later as proof. Yet the outcome held more firmly than most treaties ever did. Harlem remained untouched, not because it was constantly defended, but because no one chose to challenge it again. In the weeks after Chicago pulled back, nothing dramatic followed. No victory parades, no speeches. No sudden calm meant to signal triumph. What settled over Harlem instead was something quieter and more permanent certainty. The streets did not change their rhythm. Shops opened, music spilled from windows, runners moved as they always had. But beneath the routine was a new understanding shared without words. The question of who controlled Harlem had been asked and answered once. In the underworld, repetition is expensive. Violence is only useful if it produces clarity. What happened in Harlem produced clarity so complete that repetition became unnecessary. Stories traveled as they always do. Some exaggerated the numbers, others sharpened the drama. But the details mattered less than the conclusion everyone reached independently. Harlem was not soft ground. Harlem did not bend under pressure. Harlem responded once decisively and then stopped. That restraint mattered. Power that keeps striking invites retaliation. Power that proves itself and then withdraws invites caution. Harlem did the latter. Other cities took note. Not openly, not in headlines, but in planning rooms and late-night conversations. Expansion strategies adjusted. Maps were redrawn. Some territories were circled. Harlem was crossed out. What made Harlem different was not just organization or preparation. It was restraint backed by credibility. The neighborhood did not chase recognition. It did not broadcast its strength. It allowed others to draw their own conclusions and live with them. Years passed. The men involved aged or disappeared. New names replaced old ones, but the boundary remained intact, enforced not by constant threat, but by memory. Memory is cheaper than war and far more effective. Chicago never issued a statement explaining its decision. It did not need to. In criminal circles, silence after loss often says more than retaliation ever could. It signals that the cost-benefit calculation has been completed and closed. Harlem became something rare in organized crime history, a place defined not by conquest, but by limits. It did not expand outward. It did not overreach. It held exactly what it intended to hold. That choice protected it longer than aggression ever could have. Older men explained it simply to younger ones who asked why Harlem remained different. You don't fight where you can't win, and you don't return where the price has already been set. The victory, if it could be called, that was invisible. No bodies displayed, no warnings repeated. Just an absence that grew heavier with time. This is how real control often works. Not through constant force, but through a single moment so decisive that it never needs to happen again. Harlem did not need to remind anyone of what it could do. The memory did that work for decades. In the end, the story is not about Al Capone's ambition or Chicago's reach. It is not even about how many men crossed state lines and how many did not return. It is about something rarer. It is about a territory that understood itself well enough to draw a boundary and defend it once. The file closes here not because every detail is known, but because the outcome never changed. Harlem held. And because it held, no one came back. If you want more stories like this, stories history never wrote down cleanly, but lived with anyway, subscribe to the channel. We don't chase legends, we examine the moments that made them unavoidable. And before you go, leave a comment below. Do you believe real power comes from force, or from making your enemy decide that coming back simply isn't worth it?